Hello, everyone. Kaleb Benda here, Artistic Director and Conductor of the Oklahoma Chamber Symphony. I'm here to introduce you to a special segment in our Couch Concert series. 2020, in addition to all that's been occurring, is the centennial of the 19th Amendment, the amendment that gave women the right to vote in the United States. To celebrate this milestone, we have a very special piece for you. Unfortunately, American composers are not performed as frequently as their European counterparts, and even less so are American female composers. To commemorate the centennial, we thought that we would highlight an American female composer. Additionally, after this brief introduction, we have a conversation with Emily Virgin, a member of the Oklahoma Congress. In this conversation with her, we are able to talk about this milestone and what it means today. Caroline Shaw is a Grammy-winning vocalist and Pulitzer Prize-winning composer from Princeton, New Jersey, where she is pursuing a doctorate in composition. She holds a bachelor and master's degree in violin performance. For this performance, we will be playing her Entr'acte. This is a piece that I'm sure might be a little bit different for some of you. In 2011, after hearing a performance of Haydn's Opus 77 No. 2 string quartet, she was inspired to write a minuet and trio. However, she took what she describes as an Alice through the looking glass approach, where she flips the form on its head. Caroline uses what she describes as a kind of absurd, subtle Technicolor transition. Things are not quite what you expect, but the outline of the classical minuet and trio is still there. Caroline Shaw employs lots of extended techniques in this piece. There are different ways of playing the instrument in unusual means. Some of the indications in her score include pitchless bow noise, stop string pizzicato, slides, and indication to play over the fingerboard, producing kind of a wispy sound. The piece is in the traditional minuet and trio form and is still in a feeling of three, similar to a dance. Things really begin to take off in the trio before a recap of the minuet and ending in a beautiful cello solo by our principal cellist, Michelle Whitaker. If you would like to contribute to help us bring live music back after the pandemic and sponsor great events like this, please visit okchambersymphony.com/support. I hope you enjoy our conversation with Emily Virgin and our performance of Caroline Shaw's Entr'acte. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Kaleb Benda, Artistic Director of the Oklahoma Chamber Symphony, and I have a special guest with me for this couch concert. We have Representative Emily Virgin. For tonight's couch concert, we're going to be recording for you and performing for you a piece called Entr'acte by American composer Caroline Shaw. We're doing this in commemoration of the centennial of the 19th Amendment. That's the amendment that gave women the right to vote. And so, Representative Virgin, unfortunately, well, maybe not so unfortunately, but when people hear classical music, they think of Beethoven, Bach, Mozart, and those are all great composers, but unfortunately, they are all male, and unfortunately, also not American. Classical music just kind of got here to the States a little bit late, and females were not supposed to be classical musicians when it was at its height and at its popularity. One example I'm thinking of, I don't know if you are familiar with the name, but there's a composer named Fanny Mendelssohn, and she was an amazing composer. Her brother was Felix Mendelssohn, and many people consider her to be actually a better composer than her brother. But she got married, and her husband said, "Hey, you can't be a composer anymore, and if you do want to compose, then you have to publish under your brother's name." So we only have a couple of her works because they were published under her brother's name, because the women were just not supposed to be composers, unfortunately. So we're really excited to have you here to talk with us about this special performance. So to kick things off, I was just wondering if you could introduce yourself for us. Tell us, how did you get started in politics? What's your favorite thing about being a politician? Was it something you always wanted to do? Just a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, and hello, everyone. I'm delighted to be with you. So my name is Emily Virgin. I'm a state representative here in Oklahoma. My district is Central Norman, House District 44. So the University of Oklahoma is in my district. And I'm also the House Minority Leader, the leader of the House Democratic Caucus. So, it's fun to think back on the beginning of my career. I've been in the House for 10 years now. I'm entering my last term in office. And, in reflecting, I think that my youth and my sort of naivete were assets when I decided to run for office. Politics was always sort of accessible to me because I grew up working on campaigns and grew up working on local campaigns. And so I knew that going and knocking on people's doors and asking for their votes. If you worked hard enough doing that, then you got a good shot at winning. And so when this seat came open, I decided I would jump in. And I don't know if me 10 years older would have done that, but I'm really glad that I did. And I always am trying to convince more women to run for office, even though it definitely has its challenges. So, it's fitting, I think, that we're focusing this year on not just the right to vote, but how many women we have in elected positions. What you were saying about composers, I think applies also to women in politics. For a long time, of course, we were legally barred from being elected officials. But even once we gained the right to vote and became eligible to be elected officials, we still don't have a whole lot of representation in state government, federal government, and America is behind on this. A lot of countries that we think are behind us, we're actually behind them in terms of female representation.
Yeah, well, I think you made a lot of great points, and that kind of segues to my next question. So, thinking all the way back to the women's suffrage movement, I learned about it in school, and I really only learned about two leaders of the suffrage movement. That was Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So, I was wondering, in your opinion, who do you think is the most significant leader of the women's suffrage movement? Is there another one that we may not be as familiar with, or do one of those two, really stand out to you? And why do you think they're the most important or the most significant?
Right. I think that it wasn't necessarily wrong for our education to be focused on the two of them. But I also always try to bring attention to the fact that when the 19th Amendment was passed, that really only granted the right to vote to white women. And there's a very interesting history to look back and learn about women of color who were trying to join this movement and were excluded because it was seen as too big of a step at the time. That white women were excluding women of color. And so what I would just encourage people is to learn more about the movement in general, and about some of the women of color who were instrumental in that movement as well. And so it feels a little bit strange to celebrate it, although I do think that we should celebrate it, but I think it definitely deserves an asterisk to denote that this wasn't for all women. This was only for white women.
Absolutely. And there were a few states that actually allowed women to vote before it was a federal law. I was talking to the concert master of our group last night, actually, and the conversation about Native American women actually came up about their right to vote. So I was wondering, why do you think a few states allowed this while a majority of the country didn't before it was actually mandated as federal law to allow women to vote?
Yeah, we've always had a few states that have been more, I guess, progressive on expanding rights, whether it's voting rights or marriage or any number of the the expansion of rights that we've seen in this country. And it seems that it does take a few states to jump out there and do these things and prove that the sky doesn't fall when we expand rights to more people, and then other states will follow, and then eventually the federal government will follow. And so we've seen that a number of times. That's sort of how the right to marriage decision happened, was several states decided to do that, and now it's the law of the land. And a lot of us, it's hard to remember a time when that was such a controversial issue, but even since I've been elected, that was a controversial issue.
That's interesting. Um, I am a white male, so I can't even begin to fathom the journey that women have had to come through in order to have the right to vote. So thinking back about what I learned and what about the progress, what surprised you the most to learn about what it took to actually get the 19th Amendment ratified? Excuse me.
Yeah, so there are a lot of interesting anecdotes about just the movement itself. And there's the legislator from Tennessee, who's, I think, his mother called him and threatened him, and he was the deciding vote in the
I remember that from school,
yeah,
actually, that anecdote.
yeah, yeah. So you know, there are a lot of anecdotes about the role that women played who weren't necessarily part of the suffrage movement officially, but women who did have these conversations with their husbands, with men in their lives, and the difficulty that it caused with a lot of families, a lot of friendships. And I think that sort of bleeds over into, again, a lot of these conversations that we have about voting rights and who has the right to marry, and a lot of the conversations that we're having today. It causes these it's not just a political movement, it's a social movement as well. And to think that even though we had the right to vote, there were many women who still didn't. There were many men who were unable to vote at the time. And to think about, even though we had the right to vote, we still didn't have, the right to have a credit card in our name, couldn't get medical care really by ourselves. There were lots of other milestones that were yet to be achieved. But I think we can think of the suffrage movement as sort of kicking that off.
Absolutely. So, as we know, it's the Centennial. So the amendment was ratified in 1920. And I couldn't help but notice a few parallels. 1920 was an election year. We're living in an election year right now. We have coronavirus going on, COVID-19. They had the Spanish flu. So there's just a lot of, very interesting parallels that were happening. Um, and I know when we're sitting down talking, you're talking about elections coming up. So it's that time of the season. So do you think there were any challenges that were magnified because of what was happening in the world when women were trying to get the right to vote, when they were lobbying for this and trying to get it all to happen?
I'm sure, because I can only imagine what elected officials at the time were thinking in having a whole new voting bloc that they needed to communicate with. Of course, political communication has changed a great deal since then, but I think the principle remains the same, that people who are running for office are always trying to talk to voters and as many voters as possible. So throwing in, like I said, a whole new voting bloc who is active for the first time, I'm sure complicated some elected officials' campaigns and their plans.
Yeah, I can only imagine. Uh, so earlier I alluded to, I can't even begin to fathom what women had to go to get the right to vote, and that kind of leads me to my next question. So do you think that you value your right to vote more than a male would, because women had to fight for the right to vote, and white men were just given that responsibility, that privilege, that right to begin with, but women had to fight? Do you think you value your right to vote more than a man would?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that goes for many groups who that right was granted to later. And I think that's why you see pretty high voter turnout among women, and some other groups that gained the right to vote later. And that's unfortunate, because just because we were granted the right later doesn't mean that it's more important for us to exercise that right. I think maybe we don't take it for granted as much. But thinking about young girls today, I know that a lot of young girls, it's hard for them to imagine that there was a time when they didn't have the right to vote. And in some ways, I think that's important, because I don't want them to ever feel like they're restricted or they're different somehow. But also, I think that it's important for us to not forget that these rights are precious, and that they can be, just like they were granted, they can be taken away, they can slip away over time. And so for women, and I think minorities, it's something that maybe we're just more aware of, and perhaps more sensitive to efforts to chip away at voting rights.
Yeah. Wow. Well, I know you're a very busy woman, so to wrap things up, I have one final question, and that's just: is there anything you'd like to say to young voters, either women specifically or just young voters in general?
Well, the biggest thing that I would say is to make sure that you register to vote and exercise your right to vote. I know that it's easy to think that your vote doesn't count, but I've seen time and time again in state legislative races and local races where it's a matter of 5 or 10 or 20 votes. And so it might not seem like you make that much of a difference in a presidential election, but when it comes to who's responsible for making sure your trash gets picked up or setting your tuition for college or any number of things, that's something that you need to pay attention to local elections. And I would also say to try to be active beyond just registering to vote, because when I go talk to voters and I'm looking at who's a really active voter, it's generally always people who are older. And that's unfortunate because when you're an elected official, you're going to try to maximize your time and talk to those people who you know are going to vote every single time. I try to focus efforts more on registering people to vote, but traditionally we talk to people who we know we are going to vote, who are going to vote. And so that, I think, is how young people can have a bigger stake and more influence in the political process, is to become regular voters and encourage their peers to become regular voters. Beyond that, consider running for office. It has been an experience that I wouldn't change for the world. And we desperately need for our legislature and our policymakers to be more reflective of our population in general. When that happens, I think we get better results for everyone.
Wow, that's great. That's really insightful. Well, thank you so much, Representative Virgin, for taking this time to speak with me. And thank you for joining us in our celebration of the Centennial of the 19th Amendment. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.